The invasion of Ukraine represents a major shock to the macroeconomic environment. The invasion has disrupted energy markets, dislocating wholesale and retail prices. The consequence has been accelerated inflation, rising interest rates, and a slowing growth outlook. In these macro snapshots, we'll evaluate the implications for households as well as corporate earnings in the months ahead. The good news: inflation looks set to have peaked on both sides of the Atlantic. In the US, inflation peaked at just over 8%, and in Europe just over 10%. But now we seem to have gotten past the worst, with a decelerating rate of inflation on both sides of the Atlantic. In the US in particular, inflation is falling quickly. However, risks remain. Most notably, the role of food and energy inflation as a contributor to headline rates is relatively small in the US. That gives us the impression that inflation has bled out into the service economy. Whilst in Europe, that remains less of a concern, as the contributions to headline rates of inflation from energy and food remain strong. Nevertheless, on both sides of the Atlantic, the labour market remains too hot, with very low levels of unemployment and high levels of excess job vacancies. That's giving strength to the labour bargaining process to bargain for higher nominal wages. The latest data from both sides of the Atlantic show that nominal wage growth remains too high to be compatible with central bank targets of inflation at 2%. In the United States, for example, nominal wage growth remains at 4.4%, 4.9% in the Eurozone, and the challenges over labour supply in the United Kingdom means that nominal wage growth remains at 6%. As a consequence, interest rates are rising on both sides of the Atlantic and are likely to stay high for the foreseeable future, with no cuts planned for 2023. In the United States, the Fed base rate now stands at 4.75%, but this remains below the expected terminal rate of 5.3%. Similarly, another 0.25% is expected in the Eurozone and another 0.5% in the United Kingdom. Historically, rising interest rates have come with the risk of a so-called hard landing or economic recession, where economic activity is dislocated. Rising interest rates tends to reduce disposable income by raising the cost of servicing existing debts. Economic history urged caution at the end of the last year. Over the last 6 rate tightening cycles in the United States, 4 resulted in a hard landing. This meant that an incoming recession was the most expected economic activity on record, with 80% of professional forecasters expecting a contraction either in the fourth quarter of 2022 or in the first half of 2023. However, here there is good news also. Live and lagging indicators on consumption doesn't yet show a meaningful contraction in economic activity. When we look at consumer discretionary spending on both sides of the Atlantic, we see that it remains healthy. Whilst not showing strong growth as it has done historically, it moves sideways, stagnating as opposed to a major contraction. This gives us confidence that potentially this time we could avoid a hard landing and achieve something that has historically been relatively challenging, a so-called soft landing, where we're able to tighten interest rates without inducing a recession. Nevertheless, there are specific risks, especially for the United Kingdom. The mortgage market in the UK remains much more sensitive to changing interest rates. Whilst the prevalence of fixed mortgages is high in all of the countries evaluated, over 90% in the US and 75% in Europe, the length of tenure of fixed-rate mortgages is completely different. In the US, the average fixed-length mortgage is over 23 years, in the Eurozone 10 years, but in the United Kingdom's mortgage market, fixed-rate mortgages tend to be either of 2 years or 5 years in length. That means that over 70% of fixed mortgages are likely to need refinancing by half 2023. And as a consequence, UK households are much more susceptible to this rising rate environment. As a consequence, whilst we've seen upgrades in the economic outlook in the Eurozone and US, the UK remains the only G7 country expected to be in recession in 2023, albeit by a relatively small margin of just 0.6% this year. Also, corporate earnings have been revised upwards, showing growth in the United States of 4% and 3% in the Eurozone. Here again, the UK shows some weakness, with an expected reduction in corporate earnings of around 2%. Despite the consensus moving to a soft landing in terms of the recession, major risks remain to corporate profitability. On screen you can see the revenue growth of the S&P 500 in the first bar next to the margin growth of the S&P 500 by sector. You can see that on the revenue side of the equation, actually 2022 was a relatively good year, avoiding the major contractions that many economists thought, especially in those sectors particularly exposed to changing consumer disposable incomes. However, the margin story showed a much more pessimistic outlook, with those sectors particularly exposed to higher labour or energy costs showing major contractions on margins. Consumer discretionary, for example, saw margin contraction of 20% year on year. Concerns for market participants are this margin squeeze may well continue on account of tighter labour markets, tighter credit conditions, high energy costs and higher rates of taxation. When we look back in economic history, you can see the net income margin of the S&P 500 changing over time, averaging over the lifespan at around 8.5%, but deviating considerably both in the 2008 period, where net income margins were very high on account of very loose credit conditions and a relatively loose labour market, in stark contrast to a period in the 1970s where the labour market was very tight and credit conditions as well as energy markets were very tight also. That's raising concern that we may be moving back to an environment which is much more arduous in terms of corporate net income margins. We remain in extremely volatile and adverse economic conditions which are likely to create a challenging environment for corporate profitability in the years ahead. If you'd like support or guidance on your cost optimization journey, reach out to any of Baringa's experts.